Good evening, everyone. My name is Maggie. On behalf of Vroman's Bookstore, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for our virtual event this evening with Lorne Buchman in conversation with Tom Stern, discussing Make to Know, from spaces of uncertainty to creative discovery. We're so excited and grateful that our bookstore can continue to bring authors and their works to our community during this time. We'll be hosting more virtual events in the near future, and you can learn about them on our website, romansbookstore.com, as well as at Vroman's Bookstore. Support Vromans and our authors and purchase a copy of tonight's featured book. Just click on the green purchase button that reads Make to Know directly below the viewer screen. Tonight's books will become signed. Again, they will be signed. The link will redirect you to our website where you can continue the checkout process. We're selling digital audiobooks and ebooks through Libro FM and Kobo for those who are interested. If you'd like to ask a question during the event, please click on the Ask a Question box at the bottom of the screen and type it in. Please do not use the sidebar chat to ask a question. So tonight we have Lorne Buchman, is the president of Art Center College of Design in Pasadena. Previously, he served as president of Saybrook Graduate School and Research Center. He also served as provost and president of California College of the Arts, where he spearheaded the creation of its renowned San Francisco campus in 1994. He is the author of Still in Movement, Shakespeare on Screen. Tom Stern is the author of the novels My Vanishing Twin and Sutterfield, You're Not a Hero, published by Rare Bird Books. He's the writer and director of feature films Half Dragon Sanchez and This Is a Business. Tom's films have played festivals across the United States and Europe, and he holds a BA in philosophy from Eckerd College and an MFA in film production from Chapman University. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the camera over to Lorne and Tom. I will also put a link to buying the book in the side chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maggie. And welcome, everyone. Glad to have you all here, and glad to have the opportunity to talk about creativity and making, a subject near and dear to my heart, and not to speak for Lorne, but his as well. At least I take it that way from countless conversations on the topic, but also from the book you bothered to write. I guess maybe to start out the conversation, one of the things that I'm most moved by and most enjoy about the book is that central question. I think there are a lot of people, presumably, who are joining us tonight who are creative themselves and spend a lot of time thinking about what it means to be a creative person. I also think there are probably a lot of people joining us here tonight who have a love or an admiration of creativity, and maybe aren't themselves makers, but kind of relate to creativity through that kind of end product, right? The thing itself, the book. And so there's that kind of process piece, and as well as the kind of audience piece to it. And I think the book really beautifully and thoughtfully delves into the space of thinking about what it means to make, to be creative, and what role that kind of plays in our lives, and plays with this connection between the concept of making and the concept of knowing, which might be surprising for some people to realize that those two things are kind of interconnected. So maybe just to start us off, if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between making and knowing that you delve into in the book, that could be interesting place to start.
Thanks, Tom, and thank you for being here, and thanks to Vromans, and welcome one and all. Yeah, so what fascinates me is what the making process reveals. I love it, for example, when writers say that their characters told them what to say. Or I love it when an artist like Calder says he thinks best in wire. These are the kinds of things that intrigue me. Or Umberto Eco, hilariously in a postscript to The Name of the Rose, said, "I didn't realize Jorge was the murderer until I put him in the library." That there was something as a part of the making that he actually discovered a key point of the plot. And so that echoes with my personal experience, and it is kind of a fascinating thing to think about, that we engage in making writ large. It can be writing, it can be painting, it can be sculpting, it can be filming, it can be performing. And in that process, we are able to discover what it is we want to make through that process. And I contrast it with a kind of popular notion about what creative people do. And that popular notion has everything to do with manifesting vision. That there is some kind of vision, and the work of the artist or the work of the designer is to manifest that already kind of predetermined vision. And Michelangelo is the great example of seeing the angel in the stone and carving away until he sets it free. But when you begin to talk to most artists and designers, that's not what their process is at all. Theirs is a entering to a space of uncertainty through some urge, through a question, through a notion, some through a stomach ache, some compelling thing that makes them go actually into a place of unknown. And it's the making. It is the moving the words on the page. It is the engagement with material. It is solving the problem. Whatever it happens to be, that making process is ultimately what guides and unveils, reveals what the piece, what the product needs to be. So that's all the fascination with me in terms of what compelled me to go forward with writing this book.
And there in that is this notion too, though, that when we make, yes, we're making to make the thing, to create the thing, but that ultimately, and this is to me a really beautiful thread of the book, we're really doing it beyond that to come to understand something, to come to know something that we didn't before, which starts to play into this uncertainty as well, this kind of occupying these spaces of uncertainty. Is that fair to say? Is that accurate? That because you spoke with so many artists and designers from so many different walks of life and disciplines, is it fair to say that pretty much across the board that ultimately the knowledge was of more value to the makers than the actual thing they were making?
Well, I mean, I suppose sometimes it is, because there's an amazing joy that comes from the surprise that making reveals, or to some artists, and this distinction is made very clearly by some artists, the recognition that they experience through the making. So there is certainly the knowing that is surprise, the knowing that is recognition is part of it. But there's also a kind of deeper level too that happens, which interested me so much, and that is that the making process not only kind of reveals or allows you to know the thing that the product of your making, it also allows you to know the self in a certain kind of way. And Joan Didion writes so beautifully about this, and says, I would have no reason to write if I could access my thoughts in any other way. That her whole process of writing is to get to know herself. And so those books that she wrote in grief for her husband and then her daughter, it was all she worked it through, but also could come in touch with herself in a very profound way through the making process itself. So maybe that's part of what you're asking too, but there are all kinds of levels and different ways of knowing that come from that making process.
And did you, so to take a step back for a second, another thing that I find interesting about the book is how personal it is, where a topic like this you might think could be, analytical or clinical in some ways, but it's very clear in the way that you engage with the subject matter and the way that you engage with the creatives that you're speaking to, that this is personal too, that this is something that is an itch that's been there for you even in the book, give an anecdote about, as a child, and you're kind of reflecting upon a realization for you of artists and their ability to make certain things, and thinking of yourself in terms of whether or not you would ever be able to make those things. And can you talk a little bit about kind of where this curiosity for this topic kind of started for you?
I am make to know in just about everything I do. And it's really interesting. And I couldn't name it early on in my life, and just thought, the creativity was for the geniuses in the world. And I certainly wasn't that. And I certainly didn't have any kind of profound talent of any particular kind. And so I kind of crossed myself off the creative list, but then began to understand how I function, Make to Know, and it has informed every significant thing I've done in my life. So I mean, you think about writing a book, the Shakespeare book I wrote in the 90s, or the book that I wrote now. I really didn't know, and I had a question, I had a notion, but I went into a place of deep uncertainty with these books. And only through the making of them, in the case of Make to Know, through the conversations I had and through the writing process, but in the Shakespeare book too, just going into that space and beginning the writing, and the writing, like in a Joan Didion way, helped me understand what my thinking was all about. And I think about myself as a teacher and the experience that I had in classes, and how, you set up a framework, but finally when you go into that classroom, when you're engaging with real students in real space, there is a kind of discovery that happens as you go in a way that gives it life and spontaneity and emotion and excitement, and that you couldn't ever sort of completely plan for beforehand. As a theater director, I always marveled at other directors who could stage a play in the margins of a script. I could never do that. But when I was in the rehearsal hall, and to use Aeschylus's phrase, and necessity descended, I began to use text and move people around and work in 3 dimensions and see, and I understood how I wanted to approach that play and move that play around in the making that was rehearsal. And True Confessions, and we can talk about this a little later too, as in my leadership too. It is entirely a Make to Know process. But here's the thing that we need to think about, and we really need to realize that the mistake about Make to Know is that people assume that what we're saying is we're making it up as we go along. We're building the plane as we fly. And nothing could be further from the truth. That's not at all what I'm trying to suggest. In fact, we have experience, we have values, we have commitments, we have ways in which we want to go about something. We bring all of that together, and fundamentally, there are various levels of talent that we bring too. But to me, that's the scaffolding we stand on. That's what artists and designers have taught me in the work I've done on this book. That's the scaffolding we stand on as we reach into uncertainty. And sometimes that scaffolding is higher and larger and allows us to reach greater places. And sometimes when we're just starting, it's at a lower level. But that's the structure. That's not the making process. The making process is we draw on that, but we go into these places of uncertainty to discover and to make. And that is the critical part of all this. So then you can begin to think about all these different aspects of your life in which you stand on the scaffolding of your education, your experience, whatever it is, and you reach into uncertainty to make. And that's been deeply profound for me personally.
And is that, so what facets do you think contribute to those types of scaffolding that artists, designers work from? Education, you mentioned, it's practice, it's discipline?
Experience, discipline, skill is a huge one. And the kind of Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours, but again, that forms the scaffolding too. So those are all of the elements that I think we're really talking about when we think about that structure and that scaffolding.
And that scaffolding, I don't know why I keep thinking that, scaffolding, it basically is built up and around, or at least as I think of it from your book, sort of in an ocean of uncertainty. And that topic of uncertainty, which has come up already a couple times tonight, but it's really central to not just how artists and designers, as you unpack it, are kind of entering into their making, but also kind of how they navigate through their iterative process.
Right. Right.
Was that surprising to you as you were having conversations, how prevalent and important that role of uncertainty was? It
was, and it was so striking that just about everyone I interviewed, scores and scores of artists and designers, all talked about being in that realm and different ways of being inside it and navigating it. And this book also draws on other artists and designers who I read about or who I had different kinds of exposure to. And Amy Tan is one of those. And she a writer who really gives a fascinating kind of sense of what it's like to be in this world of uncertainty. And she uses quantum mechanics to describe it. And she confesses she knows nothing about quantum mechanics, but she wants to use it anyway. And what she does is she brings us into the sense of, as you go into this place of uncertainty, you know, she begins with a question. That's how she defines it. There are these points of entry. She defines it as, I have a question that I'm wrestling with, and that brings me into this place of uncertainty. Other artists say they just physically show up. Amy Bender, the novelist, ties herself to a chair. Somebody else has, again, like one of the poets I spoke to had a stomach ache, needed to kind of manifest that. Other people need to be within the context of a space in installation artists and theater artists. But Amy Tan talks about going into this place, and she builds and using quantum mechanics to describe how a cosmology develops as she's in this space of uncertainty. And she begins to recognize patterns, and she begins to recognize different forces that are gravitational forces that are drawing her, and different particles that she needs to assimilate. And what's interesting about Amy Tan is that this cosmology develops and builds as she writes, as she makes, and then begins to take form and allows her to find her way to what it is that she wants to create. So uncertainty, to be sure, is a stressful and frightening place, and we often don't want to go in there. But I think what I've learned through the work on this book is it's also a deeply creative place, maybe inevitably a deeply creative place, and a place that we enter, and that discovery can happen if we have the courage to go in.
And navigating spaces and moving through them. You write about, I guess, engaging materials is kind of the language you're using to focus on that kind of iterative process. Is that accurate?
Well, right. There are 4 ways in which the various different artists and designers have kind of that I can sum up what the making process is all about. And the first one is what we've been talking about, that first notion of entering uncertainty, and it happens in varying different ways and for different artists and designers. They describe that experience, but fundamentally it is about going into uncertainty. That's one. The second one is what you just said too. It's engaging material and what that means for the painter and, you know, the paint and the canvas, the dialogue between the charcoal and the paper, an artist like Anne Hamilton entering a space and feeling that space and engaging with that space, the material of that space. Edgar Arsenault with exploring a material of time. I mean, the novelist with words, that whatever the materials are, that engaging with the materials is one of the ways in which that activity, you're right, happens in these uncertain places. The third one, which I learned mainly from designers, is about solving problems. And what is that making process in uncertainty through the lens of problem solving, which becomes, at least for designers I spoke to, kind of axiomatic in terms of what they're trying to do and how they think about their work. And then the fourth is from performers, musicians, theater people, and that's improvisation. And what I love about talking about improvisation in the make to know context is that improvisation kind of crystallizes the very thing that I'm trying to get at, because the act of improvising, the process itself, is also the product created. There's no separation there. So it's a wonderful kind of paradigm for thinking about it. So those 4 areas are what becomes, which ultimately defines in the work that I did anyway, the kind of making process that we're talking about.
And are those, do those cross borders though? I mean, does a writer engage with materials in a different way because it's a different type of material? And improvisation to me feels like it's organic to any sort of making process that can strip away from a certain level of self-consciousness and get into a state of just kind of making.
Yeah, absolutely. So ultimately, all 4 of those are present in a variety of different fields and practices and disciplines. It's just in my own process, I learned from writers what it's like what the blank page is and what it's like to go into uncertainty, mainly from them. I learned from visual artists and installation artists about what it means to engage with materials. I learned about solving problems from designers. I learned about improvisation from performers. But really, there's a blend, and just as you say, it crosses all fields and all disciplines.
And we also, in some of the conversations you and I have had about the book, we also have talked a bit about process, about intention as well, and kind of the journey or the objective and that process of discovery, kind of what can be volitional or controlled in that process and what isn't. And did you find in talking with artists and designers, did you find, number one, I guess, varying degrees of self-awareness of that in their own processes, what they can control and what they can't? And number two, did you find pretty uniformly across the board that different relating to this question of how you can or can't control an end product or an end piece in terms of that discovery, how that takes root?
You know, there's a couple of different ways to answer that question. One is to actually cite the students of Art Center that I spoke to. And a common theme among students, and faculty back this up, is that they become paralyzed in their work. And they become paralyzed precisely because they don't have it all figured out beforehand. They don't have that vision figured out, and therefore they can't really get into the process because they feel like they don't know enough, as opposed to having a framework, an idea, a question, a notion, a stomachache that allows them to, that gives them an entry point into a place of uncertainty. So one way to answer your question is to say that there's something that can't be controlled here. And so when I explored that with the artists and designers I interviewed for this book, what I really discovered was that you can't control your way to discovery. What you need to do is to set up the conditions for a making that will allow that discovery to happen. And those conditions can happen in a variety of different ways. Again, sometimes it's just showing up every day to write. Sometimes it's a framework for improvisation. Sometimes it's a Gershwin melody for Miles Davis. Sometimes it's a situation for somebody improvising for the theater. But you create those conditions, but within that, the space that you create, the openness, the breeze that goes through it is critical to discovery. And what Anne Hamilton, the artist who influenced me so much in this book, what she says is, you have to almost remove intention. That's a kind of an extreme answer to your question. Because unless you remove intention, you're not going to find that kind of freedom and that flow and that space to discover. It's not empty. It has a frame. It's got a question. It's got a notion. It's got a cosmology, whatever you want to talk about. Because if you try to create something that is with the intention of making it about something, then, as Amy Tan says, it becomes about aboutness. And you're right, so that interestingly, when you have that intention or when you have a certain vision that you need to meet, it narrows possibility instead of opening up discovery. And that was such an important learning in all.
And precludes the point of entry ultimately, right? Like it in a specific intention can keep you from even being able to move into that space because uncertainty is a requisite component of moving into that space.
Right. Exactly.
So stepping back then, which in some ways is asking again a question, I suppose, about kind of your personal entry into all of this, but it strikes me that I think the book ultimately is about more than creativity and making. I think, and you do culminate the book in a chapter about the implications of how we live, right? What does it mean to go beyond the notion of this making in kind of intentional and just exclusively, I guess, what we would create what we would think of as a creative endeavor to make a thing. But what are the broader implications that you walked away from in terms of just what it means about living life?
Yeah, well, I think there are profound implications for how we live. I think we are, as human beings, we makers. And I think that we make our lives and come to know our lives through making. I think, like the students that I identified at Art Center, in their early days, I think some of us can get stuck, that we don't have all of life figured out. We don't have that vision, and we paralyze ourselves. We don't have the strength, sometimes the courage, maybe the support to move into places of uncertainty in our lives, and to know that ultimately our life can be a deeply creative endeavor. To ground this a little bit, my interest is to look at the way in which we educate our children, or for that matter, how we educate college students at Art Center, how we build curriculum, how we build requirements. We have a vision for what we want our students to know, and what we do is we build requirements. Requirements is probably the least creative way to set up. I mean, I think you need requirements in a certain way, but if we think about what improvisation teaches us, to build frames, to build open ways for students to engage, to find their way, to set their own path, creating those places for them, held with values, with scaffolding, but to go into places of discovery themselves, what that might mean for educating a generation of makers, instead of trying to ascribe to a certain vision of what we want them to be, and then creating a structure for that to happen. These are interesting questions anyway about education. Leadership for me personally is a really interesting piece of it. And I tell this story in the book about this very dangerous intersection in Holland. And to me, it's a wonderful metaphor for so much of what we've been talking about this evening. And the story goes as this: it was in a town in Holland, an incredibly dangerous intersection, all sorts of cars crashing and pedestrians being hit and bicyclists being knocked over. And the more the accidents occurred, the more the various different transportation authorities put up signs to instruct people on what to do, to slow down, to watch out here, to look. And it had zero effect. It was completely useless. And in fact, in certain ways, it kept on getting worse. And a traffic designer by the name of Hans Mortemann was hired to help try to solve the problem. And his approach was that the more you kind of put the structures that narrowed possibility, the more accidents were going to happen. And so he was inspired by a crowded skating rink where he saw human beings skate together, and there was like an instinct that they kind of moved together in a kind of graceful way, in a certain kind of choreography that was almost innate to them. And rarely was there sometimes people went wild, but rarely was, people took care, right? Or a flock of birds that you can watch in the sky, or a school of fish who just seem to have the instinct to move together. And with that inspiration, he said, what we want to do is we want to remove things, and we want to set up a structure, a framework called a roundabout. And so they took away all the signs, they redesigned the intersection entirely, and they created a roundabout. And immediately, cars slowed down, the accidents went to zero, pedestrians weren't hit, the bicyclists were fine, because people took it upon themselves. They took their own authority. They were involved in a process where it wasn't just listening to some sort of superego telling you what to do, but in fact allowed you to find your way and be a kind of part of the solution, creatively engaged, a maker in a safe intersection. And to me, that sums up, that's a beautiful metaphor for so many things, but in this particular instance, it's a metaphor for what a make-to-know leadership might be, which is deeply meaningful to me, in that you, as leaders, create roundabouts for communities, metaphorically speaking, for communities to thrive. for people to draw what's best in people, to draw their own instincts, to make them makers in a college community or whatever community, in this case, art center, to engage with the best of themselves and as creatively as they possibly can. And that's a kind of make to know leadership. And that's a way in which the whole concept of make to know holds these very deep implications for how we might live our lives and practice our work.
Well, beautifully said, and articulated beautifully in the book, and just I suppose just congratulations on the book. I know the process that you went through, and I know the time it took, and the countless conversations, but you really have wound up with something that, as a creative person myself, it's just a beautiful thing to be able to look at and to see something articulated. It's hard to understand as a creative person. It's hard to step outside and to think about your own process and to think about the implications of that process and to think about how that should inform how you live, how you make, but also how you live, and always trying to get better at making, but always trying to get better at living. And it beautifully kind of distills into amber those facets for me. So congratulations.
A couple of things to say. First of all, folks should know that Tom is a first-rate writer himself and was a wonderful interview for the book and opened up all sorts of ideas for me. So I want to offer you that recognition and that gratitude as well. And you should all read his books that were mentioned earlier. But also to say, this hopefully kind of can democratize creativity in a certain way. And, I write in the book that our sense of creativity is so narrowly defined in our culture by geniuses and mad people and those who channel divinity and divine inspiration, the muses that go back to Homer. In Western culture, there's a very narrow way of thinking about creativity, which is why, to go back to your earlier question, as a child, I felt like I had no access to it. But we are makers all. We make our lives, we make our work. And we need experience, and we need community, and we need all of that to give us the courage to go into these places of uncertainty. We need to dignify our own questions and our own notions to go to the places of uncertainty. But in that we can make and we can discover. And it seems to me if we can shift our thinking a little bit, our attitude, to open up to what that making might reveal, we might know something on a very deep level that otherwise would not be available to us.
Well, let's open it up for questions. So there's a functionality at the bottom of your screen, which is the Ask a Question. So if you click on that, you can type in and post questions, delve into these same topics with us. And while we wait for that, another project on the horizon? What's the next? And
I still have this day job as president of Art Center, so that's certainly taking my time and my commitment and a lot of my love. But I do have some ideas for the next book too that I hope to begin to. I'm not like you, Tom. I just can't do it every day. So as you do. Tom had Elie Wiesel as a teacher who told him if he wants to be a serious writer, he's just needs to do it every day, whether it's good or not. And that's the way you show up. That's your making process, right? That's how you enter and find discovery.
Yeah, but for some reasons, I think that is my process. For some of the reasons have to do with uncertainty in those ways, right? It doesn't let you think too much about what you're going to do. It doesn't give you the time to overanalyze or overthink. You just grab a paddle and you start rowing, and so I feel like that helps to preserve that. And yeah, I do like to reflect on. So how Dr. Wiesel said that if I took myself seriously as a writer, I'd sit down and write every day. The thing he didn't tell me is that in and of itself wasn't a sufficient condition to be a serious writer. So it's a piece. I try.
Right.
That much, but yeah.
It gets you into the rhythm and the process too.
Yeah. So, okay, we got a couple questions here. The first one comes from Solveig Xiao. How has the process of creativity and making shifted during this pandemic? And what's it like to release this book at this particular moment in history and time?
Thank you, Solveig. That's a beautiful question. And because, we are living in times of such profound uncertainty. So at the very least, it gives us a way to wrestle with the reality of what that is. Again, a stressful and destabilizing space, but also, if we think about it, one that can be deeply creative. And as we saw in a place like Art Center, but you can see it in all kinds of places, it's, again, not so much what happens to us, but how we respond. And that becomes the focus of our thinking, how we respond creatively to these circumstances and these conditions, and what we come to know through the making at these times of uncertainty. So there is a, and you can do these kind of Google searches too about, words that become dominant and sort of boil up in our discourse. And uncertainty is like number one or something, or number two. I mean, that word has become something that is prevalent in our discourse, and it's because of this pandemic and what we're living in and how we're trying to struggle with it and make our way, deliberately said that way. Releasing the book during this time, I suppose those echoes are significant, and hopefully it will maybe release us a little bit, be maybe a little kinder to ourselves, give us the opportunity to look at this moment and find what we can create within it.
We have a question from Nikos as well. Could you talk more about American or U.S. notions of creativity as compared with other cultures or nations?
Right. Yeah. Really, really, really interesting. So there are different attitudes about this and different ways of exploring it. My interest really was to look at how creativity was defined in Western culture. And as I was saying before, the three threads that I saw as being the major pieces of that were a preoccupation with genius and the history of genius that goes back to ancient times, and at a point in the Enlightenment became not so much having genius, because genius was like a tutelary god that visited you, to being a genius, and it was something internal, and the preoccupation we had with that going forward, so that genius became this definer. And if you didn't reach a certain very narrow, limited, very male, very patriarchal way of defining genius, if you didn't fit into that, somehow you weren't accepted within the realm of what we define as creative. The second is a preoccupation with madness and the association of the creative person, of the artist in particular, as being somehow mad. And you can think about all of the various different artists historically in Western culture that we have become focused on, and the way in which we relate to it, because there is sort of some touch of madness that's involved. And again, narrowing the definition of the creative by a kind of preoccupation with that. And then the third piece of it is really divine inspiration. I talked about that earlier, the whole concept of what the muse is. But the important part of this definition is it channels that a certain elected few are chosen to channel the gods, the muses, and they're the ones who are creative. But it comes from without. It's not about a grind. It's not about a making process. It's about inspiration that comes through us. And your question is very complicated with other cultures as well. There's varying ways of looking at that and thinking about that. But my interest was really to kind of trace it within our own culture and within the culture of the artists and designers that I was talking to.
We also have in the chat, Tim Moffat is sort of thinking about the solution of the roundabout and how that overlays with some of the tensions. He's pointing specifically to sort of like the tension between Republican and Democrat, but I would even broaden it to think about, kind of binary thinking on topics in general, kind of how that roundabout notion could play into that, an intuitive solution to kind of those binary situations or dynamics.
Yeah, that whole design solution by Monderman, has so many important principles for how we live, and maybe that's another way to address Solvay's question too about this particular moment. We get into places of tension, as you point out, of binaries. Kind of tribal thing of separating ourselves because we become committed to one single vision. We become committed to one single sort of sense of authority and don't give uncertainty its place. And don't give a place for human beings to come together to thrive and to work together and to draw out what's best in us. Instead, we create the signs, we create the rules, we create the separation, we create the policies that tend to separate rather than integrate. And we can bang the table all day long about how we all need to pull together, but until we're willing to release some of that, those sort of guiding, authoritative visions, and open up a little bit to a world of uncertainty, I think it's not going to be a very effective transformation.
Fair enough. All right. So all the questions I see now, if there are any others, feel free to throw them out into the chat. Otherwise, I guess to wrap us up, I think, again, to me, it keeps coming up again and again, these notions, the same kind of concepts, the same ideas, but I think this question of uncertainty for me, how uncertainty is something that fosters the creativity, but is also something that
is terrifying.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. So it is simultaneously the solution and the problem, right?
Yeah.
And there's something fascinating in that to me.
So maybe to kind of touch on that, I'll share this as we sort of close here, and that's I cover in the book some of the functional MRI studies that are made that people have explored, people on improvisation, and tried to study what happens to the brain in when people are improvising, and I go into the details of it. But I just wanted to leave people with this one notion, and that is that one of the studies suggested that the improvising brain, is the same as the brain in REM sleep. So it's the same as the dreaming brain. So we think about our dreams, right? Talk about going into places of uncertainty, talk about places of not having control. But when you think about our dreams as improvisations, again, this everyday notion, we are makers of our dreams, and we are makers of that situation. And if you allow, the dreams and the making that happens in those dreams can allow you to come to know things and know yourself in some of the most profound ways possible. So this idea, this suggestion that improvising, which is exactly as I suggested, the kind of making that was so interesting to me, that it parallels or mirrors our own dream life, is just a beautiful way to kind of bring it back onto this very human level of what make to know really means and how much we are fundamentally makers in our lives. Creative all.
So great. So Maggie, I don't know if you want to wrap up or.
Well, thank you both. That's a wrap on our presentation. Thank you again to our guests and to everyone who tuned in this evening. We greatly appreciate everyone's time and your support of independent bookstores. Support Vroman's and our authors and purchase a copy of tonight's featured book. Just click on the green purchase button that reads Make to Know directly below the viewer screen. If you'd like regular updates on our upcoming events, make sure to follow us on Crowdcast and subscribe to our newsletter. Have a great evening, and as always, stay safe, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.